Hello gentlemen, this is MGTOW. This is a response to Julia Tourianski's video, The Men's Rights Movement. I've put a link to that video in the description bar. And I guess I should start out by saying normally I would have ignored such a video because it's just packed full of shaming language and it's nothing new. However, because this is coming from the libertarian angle now, I thought it important that I put out a response there because she does bring up a lot of points. In my opinion, she does this very poorly, but I'll allow you to be the judge of that. So here we go.
I'm incredibly disappointed in the men's rights movement.
Okay, so judging by your tone, I'm assuming you think your approval is something we should aim for.
Like any reactionary movement, it would not exist in the first place if there wasn't a real problem to react to. And again, like most reactionary movements, it was bound to mutate and become bastardized eventually. But this fast? Factions of the men's rights movement and even some of its foundational principles have been radicalized and pushed towards the brink of absurdity. Something that started out, in my opinion, as a voice for males reacting to the radicalization of the feminist movement and speaking out against total inequality in specific realms of our society, is now on a very rapid decline to the level of radical feminism, which is pretty low.
Julia, you incorrectly assume that the men's rights movement started as a response to feminism. This is simply incorrect. The men's rights movement started out as a response to gynocentrism, specifically the gynocentric aspects of the legal system where women were awarded primary caregiver status in the majority of child custody cases, where men were lumbered with unfairly high alimony payments for life in certain states at a time in history where women could work. Feminism is a symptom of gynocentrism, but the men's rights movement was never, at least in its original conception, an anti-feminist movement.
We need safe spaces where women can't trick us by wearing makeup and flattering clothes. My girlfriend should pay for all the things because she took my job. Ban Lululemon because their pants are made of lies. We must have trigger warnings on all movies with strong female leads. If woman no sleep with me because I'm ugly, poor, and not funny, it means that she's a shallow gold-digging whore who feels entitled to entertainment. At least feminism had a lot of help in its demise. It was co-opted and perverted and utilized for a divide and conquer strategy that served the power hierarchy.
Uh-oh, conspiracy theory time. Okay, I'll get the tinfoil hat and I have some music for us to play.
The men's rights movement seems to have done this all on its own. And I still think that the men's rights movement has a lot of credible criticisms of how we interact with males versus females in our society. I think at least half of their platform still maintains logic and decency and merit. But the other half is based on ridiculous assertions that have nothing to do with reality and perhaps stem from hate instead of logic.
Julia, that's the either-or logical fallacy, whereby the arguer characterizes a complex problem with many possible solutions as having only two possible solutions, one desirable and one not. So a movement such as this, in your opinion, can only come from one of two places, logic or hate. How about they use logic to see that men were getting a shitty deal and then began to resent and even hate women who were the primary beneficiaries of state largesse and government-granted privileges? That seems a little bit more plausible to me.
So I guess I'll start with the positives, because if the internet has taught me anything, it's that boys are sensitive to military conscription. I don't believe in it at all. I don't think men should be forced to go to war. I don't think women should be forced to go to war. And if there are some males in the movement who think because males are conscripted to go to war that females should be too, you should be fighting for nobody to be conscripted.
Sure thing. I would personally prefer that not a single individual is conscripted. The libertarian in me considers this to be slavery. However, in many parts of the world, conscription is very, very much still seen as the done thing. For example, in the Vietnam conflict, America conscripted people, and I believe they did so in both world wars. In such a situation, the government must conscript both genders equally or none at all. Notice how very, very few women argue against conscription because they actually never have to serve against their will in the armed forces. In fact, as far as I can tell, the easiest way to end conscription for men would be to extend conscription to women. Society would then turn on this barbaric practice of slavery real fast if women's lives were on the line. Just as society is now turning on the concept of alimony since it's now beginning to affect women. So women have really never cared that men were conscripted. In fact, it was a woman by the name of Phyllis Schlafly, an anti-feminist, who successfully mobilized a campaign against the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment to the US Constitution, the same amendment which would have either ended selective service for both genders or made them mandatory for both genders.
Okay, now I'm going to talk about some of the things that the men's rights movement pushes that make me just never want to credit them with anything logical ever again. And I understand that this isn't a unified movement and there's different strands and factions and opinions, but I'm still gonna acknowledge some of the retardedness that goes on. Domestic violence. Yes, I do think we need to acknowledge that there are men who are abused by their female spouse physically. But to claim that it happens just as much as it happens to a female is plainly insane.
You mean even when it's backed up by research from highly credible sources such as, for example, the CDC or the Departments of Justice, who have absolutely no reason whatsoever to be biased and who reported as far back as 2010 that 40% of domestic violence victims are men. Also, the absolute numbers are actually pretty deceptive since men are often treated as second-class citizens just simply because police forces don't take domestic violence initiated by women very seriously. Male victims are almost always invisible to the authorities such as the police, who can rarely be relied upon to take the man's side, and the plight of these men is largely overlooked by the media in official government reports and government policy. For example, in the provision of refuge places, 7,500 for females exist in the United Kingdom and Wales, where I live, but only 60 for men. So it's actually likely that the official figures underestimate the true number of male victims because culturally it's very, very difficult for men to bring these incidents to the attention of the authorities. Men are reluctant to say they've been abused by women because it's seen as unmanly and weak.
Now, this isn't because I have a female bias. This is because of observable truths about our biology. Women are the physically weaker sex. For an average man to hurt an average woman takes almost no effort. For an average woman to hurt an average man takes a lot of effort. The males have an advantage in a domestic violence situation. There are exceptions. There's women that are large and men that are small. But generally speaking, that is the observable biological truth.
Julia, actually that isn't the case. That is what's known as a surface truth. You are correct, women are on average physically smaller and weaker. However, the evidence shows as a result of the fact that they are physically smaller and weaker than men, and also because they assume they'll get away with it, women are far more likely to reach for weapons during a physical altercation, according to the Zor Institute. So men do not necessarily have an advantage in a domestic altercation that turns physical. What you're also asking is that women are exempt from moral standards of behavior and legal responsibility, that we give them special privileges because they happen to have mammary glands and a vagina. Let's flip this around. Let's say we have two guys. One of them is 5'7" and the other is 6'5". So there's a very, very clear size difference here. We would not extend to the smaller guy any form of compassion if he just completely unprovoked attacked the other guy who's 6'5". We would say, look, you realize this guy is bigger than you and you just attacked him for absolutely no reason whatsoever. Why did you do that? You know he's going to kick your ass. Why should men have one set of rules socially and legally and women have another? My advice to women is this: since you are physically smaller and weaker, do not go around putting your hands on people.
So to claim that there's just as much physical domestic violence from women against men is totally bonkers. They quote statistics, and I'm going to read you something that sums up the validity of those statistics. It turns out that these statistics of male abuse, hard and numerical as they are, were gathered by dubious means. When men are identified in police reports as abusers, that is, when women have been sufficiently battered for the police to take an interest, they are frequently questioned later and asked the leading question of whether they were also abused by their partner. Given the opportunity, they are often happy to report that in fact they were.
Well, that seems to me like good police work. If I were a police officer and I was called out to a domestic dispute, and it's very, very clear both couples have been fighting, and I would ask the woman, hey, has there been domestic abuse here? And then I would turn to the man and say, hey, look, were you also a victim of domestic abuse? That actually sounds pretty sound. So what should they be asked? Would you like a situation where, let's say, for example, a woman just randomly attacks a guy, and this does happen. And again, the statistics show that 40% of domestic violence at a minimum is carried out by women, and also evidence suggests that they're far more likely to reach for weapons. So I guess my question to you is this: the police officer shows up, it's very, very clear that they've either both been fighting, or let's say, it's very, very clear he's been attacked. What should he be asked? Should he be asked anything at all, in your opinion? Or simply because he has a penis, it should be assumed he's a perpetrator? Is that what you would like?
Although they seldom report serious or even noticeable injuries.
Serious or noticeable injury is not important. Did she physically abuse him? Just because she was unsuccessful in her attempts to maim, disfigure, or grievously harm him does not excuse her actions. Did she physically assault him?
Usually, the quid for which the beating or killing was the quo turns out to have been speech or shoving or slapping. Yet these reports are becoming part of the truth about spousal abuse that is reported in the media. Yes, women slap and push guys around, kicking them, whatever. I've seen the videos. But the guy can easily defend himself by restraining her or leaving unless she's using a weapon.
Julia, okay, I think I'm starting to figure out how you want this to work now. So somebody should be able to push and slap me around just because they're physically weaker than me. That's nonsensical. And in reality, what that will achieve is to invite more violence on men, since women know that men are socialized not to strike back. The best way to end female violence on men is for women to be fearful of consequences, either in a swift reprisal or legal penalty. And according to the Zur Institute, research suggests that women commit domestic violence on average because they think they can get away with it. So your chief concern here, Julia, seems to be that a group of men are tired of women being handed a blank check to be violent and murderous without legal or social consequence.
There's no reason to justify punching a woman back. Look at the size of your arm compared to the size of her arm.
Okay, well, just in case you want the soundbite, here it is. If a woman hits me, I will punch back hard with the intention of making sure she cannot do it again. I will use all of my strength. And that's exactly what I would do if a man were to hit me. He would feel the full force, and if he had a weapon, I would reach for the nearest thing to me that enables me to protect myself. If a woman comes at me with a weapon, yes, I will do the same. So yes, I will hospitalize a woman who hits me. In your caption, you make an illogical reference to heavyweight and lightweight boxing classes, thereby taking all of the agency off women who fail to realize that they're lightweights in your own estimation. I prefer to treat women like thinking, sentient human beings who understand risk and consequences. If you attack a stronger male, expect to be carried away. If you attack with a weapon, expect to have a hard, long road to recovery in a hospital ward.
Nobody should be hitting anybody else. If a man is hit and he doesn't overreachingly hit the woman back, yeah, she should be charged for abuse. There's a discrepancy there. But to claim that just as many men are battered by women as women battered by men sets a pretty low bar for what battering means.
No, it does not. You're arguing for a fluid definition of battering depending on the gender of the perpetrator. Wikipedia defines battering as to hit heavily and repeatedly with violent blows. This works for me as a definition. If I'm subject to such behavior, I will defend myself using whatever means I deem to be reasonable.
Why don't you guys focus on battling things that women are actually doing to men, like severe psychological abuse? Yeah, I think in relationships, women are pretty good at that and are just as abusive as men psychologically. I've also heard the men's rights movement claiming that men are just as frequently raped as women. Yeah, by other men.
Okay, Julia, here I think you may need a little history lesson and also a bit of a lesson in how society tends to make up laws, and particularly laws for non-violent offenses. In the early 20th century, much of the impetus for the Prohibition movement in North America came from moralistic Protestants, and that's according to Wikipedia. The Prohibition movement coincided with the advent of women's suffrage, with newly empowered women as part of the political process strongly supporting policies that curbed alcohol consumption. According to the Cato Institute, a source that you should know very, very well as a libertarian, before Prohibition and the Harrison's Narcotics Act of 1914, there were about 4,000 federal convicts, fewer than 3,000 of whom were actually housed in a federal prison. By 1932, the number of federal convicts had increased 561% to 26,589, and the federal prison population had increased 366%. Much of the increase was due to violations of the Volstead Act and the other prohibition laws. The number of people convicted of prohibition violations increased 1,000% between 1925 and 1930, and fully half of all prisoners received in 1930 had been convicted of such violations of drug and alcohol offenses. So let's pause here. Yes, men are the ones responsible for raping other men in prisons, but the legal impetus to pass the laws that predominantly harmed men was driven by the moralistic sensibilities of women who bitched and moaned that they were unable to have absolute control over their husbands, who, heaven forbid, might want to have a drink after a 16-hour manual labor workday. Women newly armed with the legal right to menace others through the electoral system quickly used the laws to fill the jails with men who found themselves the victims of sexual abuse.
There's a huge undeniable issue in prisons, and nobody cares because they're prisoners and we have a terrible system. That's a whole thing in and of itself. Oh, and guess what? It's, again, not about sexism against men, because there are male security guards in female prisons who routinely rape the female prisoners. I'm pretty sure the abuse in prisons is pretty equal when it comes to sexes. We should acknowledge that there are different hotspots in our limbic systems that are activated during sexual arousal depending on your gender.
No way.
For females, it's mostly the ventral medial hypothalamus, which is also a hotspot for estrogen and progesterone. For men, it's the medial preoptic area, which is also a hotspot for testosterone and androgen. Both of these areas are in the hypothalamus. The difference is that in men, the amygdala also plays a small role in their sexuality. The medial preoptic area guides the performance of sexuality, and the amygdala creates motivation. The scary thing is the amygdala is also the center for aggression in males. This just might explain why there is a much higher propensity for males to confuse sex with violence.
I call bullshit on your armchair neuropsychology. Either you can back this up with a source that is credentialed or that is complete horseshit. Men do not as a gender confuse sex with violence any more than women do. 50 Shades of Grey, a book that chronicles the BDSM relationship between a woman and a dominant male, has actually sold over 125 million copies, predominantly to women worldwide. And again, the source for this is in the description bar. The motion picture of this book has grossed over $500 million, and the book has been translated into 52 languages already. And this was a book written by women, for women. The human ape very, very much closely associates sex and violence for a number of very, very complex evolutionary and psychological reasons. This topic is a little bit too wide for this response video, but I categorically reject that assertion unless you have a credentialed source that men are more likely to associate sex with violence. This actually isn't the case.
Prison sentences. Yes, men get longer sentences than women on average. I don't think this is a result of intended discrimination. I think judges and jurors are used to seeing more men commit violent crimes, which they do. So when a woman does it, it's just something they're not used to. It's just something that's not as normalized in society, from which follows that they give her a lighter sentence.
Sorry, I really don't follow your logic here. So because men as a whole are more likely to commit violent crimes, then the individual man who finds himself at the mercy of the court will receive a longer sentence, and the opposite for women. And let me guess, you want men to stop bitching about this. Julia, the reasons that men receive longer sentences lies in a number of issues, including firstly, male disposability, which is a consequence of our sexual dimorphism. Secondly, the fact that most of the courts in the USA have for a very, very long time used something known as evidence-based sentencing has a major role to play here. And according to the American Bail Coalition, evidence-based sentencing seeks to help judges advance the crime prevention objectives of punishment by equipping them with the tools of criminologists, recidivism, risk prediction, instruments grounded in regression models of past offender outcomes. These instruments give considerable weight to criminal history, which is already central to modern sentencing schemes. However, they also add something new: explicit inclusion of gender, age, and socioeconomic factors such as employment and education. And the author put in brackets, with socioeconomically disadvantaged males and young offenders receiving higher risk scores. And then just to continue, some instruments also include family background, neighborhood of residence, and/or mental or emotional disorders. Do you see how crazy this is? So they take into account your gender, which they automatically will say, well, this gives you a higher chance of reoffending, so we're going to give you a longer sentence. They'll take into account your lack of education. Men are dropping out of schools. And again, there are lots and lots of reasons for that, why men are falling behind in the school system. And I've actually put together a video on that on my channel. So they'll take all of these factors into account, and then males get longer sentences and they're sent to jail more often. That we receive longer sentences and harsher punishments for the same crime. So, and just to kind of go back here, and the author of this particular article said, evidence-based sentencing has been widely hailed by judges, advocates, and scholars as representing hope for a new age of scientifically guided sentencing. The idea is to replace judges' clinical evaluation of defendants, that is, a reliance on their own expertise, with actuarial risk prediction, which is purportedly more accurate. Incongruously, this trend is now being pushed by progressive reform advocates who hope it will reduce incarceration rates by enabling courts to identify low-risk offenders. In this article, I argue that they are making a mistake. As currently practiced, evidence-based sentencing should be seen as neither as progressive nor especially scientific, and it is almost surely unconstitutional. And this is where I find this author to be really, really great and rational, because this is all men are asking for. So the author goes on, equal treatment of all persons is a central normative objective of the criminal justice system, and evidence-based sentencing may have serious social consequences, contributing to the concentration of the criminal justice system's punitive impacts among those who already disproportionately bear its brunt. Moreover, the expressive message of evidence-based sentencing, the justification of disparate treatments based on statistical generalizations about crime risk, is, when stripped of the scientific language, toxic. Group-based generalizations about dangerousness are not innocuous. They have an insidious history in our culture, and the express embrace of additional punishment for the poor conveys the message that the system is rigged. This is why men are upset, Julia. Not because a jury will sit down and say, well, we don't like the look of this guy. No, but because the system quite literally is set up, if you're a young male, to put you in jail for longer periods of time versus a female for the same crime. And you really don't understand, it seems, how the criminal justice system actually works. So the jury decide on guilt or innocence based on the evidence. At least that's how it claims to work. They don't issue a sentence. The judge issues a sentence. So do you actually do any background research when you make your videos, or did you just spout stuff off? What men want is equal treatment before the law, not your platitudes on why we receive harsher sentences or your feeble attempts to pass it off as normal behavior. We see the blatant unfairness and ask both genders to serve the same time for the same crime.
And sometimes being a woman actually hurts you because of that expectation for women being less violent. Like Pamela Smart's case. Pamela Smart didn't even kill anybody. She was alleged to have influenced 3 young males to kill her husband.
Yes, Julia, such a situation is known as a conspiracy. What basically happens is this. Let's say, for example, I'm a mafia boss, and I order my henchmen to commit a murder, so they make the hit. I'm just as culpable as the guy who pulled the trigger. I do not have legally diminished responsibility just because I didn't kill the victim myself. Are you basically upset that her pussy pass was revoked? Sorry, you used the word alleged? Smart was convicted by a jury of her peers of convincing her 15-year-old student and a lover to kill her husband. She had ample opportunity to present her evidence of supposed innocence and challenge the prosecution's evidence. On the back of the court case, she was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison.
Yet, she got a longer sentence than Charles Manson.
And let me guess, that's because she was a woman. No, she received a longer sentence because of the unprovoked nature of the attack. The fact that it was premeditated, because she recruited 3 minors to pull the trigger and then tried to pass it off as a home invasion. In the same way that Al Capone died in prison, she was not allowed to get away with initiating violence by proxy, something that seems to concern you greatly.
And longer than 3 of the boys that actually did the killing. Here's the one I have the biggest problem with. In 2006, the American National Center for Men backed a lawsuit known as DeBay versus Wells. The case concerned whether men should have the opportunity to decline all paternity rights and responsibilities in the event of an unplanned pregnancy. Okay guys, that's fucking retarded. Let me explain a hate fact to you. When you engage in intercourse, there is a possibility you will have a baby.
No way.
Even though most of the time you engage in intercourse, it's proximal, meaning it feels good. that doesn't change the underlying motivation, which is distal, which means to pass on your genes. No matter how you spin it or dress it up or rationalize it, intercourse at its foundation is for the purpose of creating babies. Whether both of your expectations were that this is just for fun, whether she told you that she was on birth control and she wasn't, whether your condom slipped off, whether you forgot to pull out, doesn't matter. You participated in an act that has the possibility of resulting in a baby. I know that some women are pretty shitty and will lie about being on the pill and trick you into being the father of their child. Guess what, guys? You're still 50% responsible for that child, whether it was conceived out of love, by accident, or by a lie.
So if I'm to understand this correctly, Julia, even if a woman sperm jacks a man, lies to him deliberately, or chooses to stop using contraceptives, then she has diminished responsibility. Your version of libertarianism seems to be pretty simple. Women can do anything they want, and all of these social and legal responsibilities of said actions are to be borne by males. Occasionally, when you have facts and evidence to back up a position, you'll use it. When you do not, you'll resort to name callings and appeals to be a real man. Have you ever thought of informing women that sex has consequences, that they should be using birth control if they don't want to create life?
Is that unfair? I don't think so. Pretty sure guys were smart enough to pull out before fire was invented, so just do that if you don't want to get a girl pregnant. Those getting red flags right now, the pull-out method is actually more effective than condoms, just as effective as hormonal birth control when done properly. How to do it properly? Well, you pull out before you ejaculate. The only way to mess this up is if you don't pull out before you ejaculate, or if you ejaculate prior to sex without peeing in between. When you pee, the urine clears out the urethra and destroys any sperm that may be trapped in the tract.
No way.
If you don't pee and there's sperm trapped in the tract, then the pre-cum may impregnate the woman even if you pull out. So, again, to reiterate to all of you who are confused, if you don't want to get a woman pregnant, have a pee, then have sex with her and pull out before you ejaculate. Another suggestion, if you really don't know her or she has a history of lying, or if you just want to be extra safe, also wear a condom. Also, on the subject of women being evil and tricking men into having babies with them, what about all the dudes who knock up a girl and she wants to get rid of it, and he says, "No, baby, I love you, I want to be the daddy, let's move in together, I'll support you, blah, blah, blah." 6 months later, or right after the baby is born, or a year into it, dude runs away, never to be seen again.
That's her problem. She should have picked a guy who wouldn't run away. Maybe she was a nagging bitch who the man couldn't stand. After all, most sane people don't run away from pleasant, agreeable people. However, they do tend to absolutely flee from the argumentative, absurd, and parasitic. This actually tells you more about the women than the men.
My point is, we're pretty equally shitty guys, so please stop blaming girls for all your problems and use your brain.